think we're going to get started here. There's, if anyone at any point wants to come down and get seconds on the pizza, feel free. Just wanted to say hello. My name is Daniel Ferguson. I am a co-chair of Duke Outlaw, and I wanted to welcome you all here to our discussion today about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I wanted to introduce our speakers. First, we have Thomas Clark. Tom, I believe he prefers to be called. He is, among other things, a retired commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve. He is now a board member at Servicemembers Legal Defense Network since 2001 and currently serves as the organization's treasurer. He received his undergraduate degree in economics from Duke and an MBA from Harvard, and is the former president of the Duke University Alumni Association and is now and has been since 2005 on the board of trustees at Duke. He has received 2 honorary Doctor of Law degrees, one from Cumberland College and another from Union College. He was, during his time at Duke, he was at ROTC at Duke and was on active duty from 1971 to 75 during the Vietnam era and continued his military career in the reserves, retiring as a commander. He subsequently had a career in banking in New York and currently resides there. And he is also involved in various nonprofit boards in arts and education. And also we have Aaron Tax, who is a managing attorney at Servicemembers Legal Defense Network. And he has been there since 2006. And prior to joining SLDN, he spent 3 years working for the Department of the Army. During that time, 2 years as a Presidential Management Fellow, where he served as a Special Assistant United States Attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. He has practiced labor law with the U.S. Army V Corps, the Office of the Staff Judge Advocate in Heidelberg, Germany, and in his final year with the Army, Aaron wrote final agency decisions in employment discrimination cases. He earned a BS in policy analysis from Cornell University and a JD from George Washington University School of Law, or Law School, excuse me. All right, there's many other things I could go on with both of their introductions, actually, but I'll get to the program, and I guess I'll turn it over to Aaron. Tom. That's what I exactly meant.
There you go.
All right.
Good afternoon. This is pretty informal, at least my part is going to be, so we're hoping to have some questions and comments from you all. So I'm the senior guy, so meaning old, and so I get to go first, and I get to be general, and Aaron will follow me and be much more specific with what's going on as to the law and efforts to repeal the law and activities at SLDN. I was pleased, very pleased, when Dan asked me to speak on this topic, even though, as you have already or will quickly discover, I am in no way a professional speaker, complicated by the fact that I have a cold, which you might hear, because this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I think we're reaching an inflection point where hopefully we'll see some change in this law in the near future. Now, I was contemplating, of course, what is the audience we should expect here. So just noodling about this at home, I thought, well, there are 5 possible reasons people might be here to hear about this topic. Some of you might simply be interested in the civil liberties or human rights issue here. Number 2, since we're in a law school, you might be interested in the intricacies of a law that actually mandates employment discrimination, when, of course, the trend tends to be in the other direction. A third possibility is that some of you might be interested in an organization that was formed to combat the effects of that law. then I thought you might be interested in the actual efforts we're undertaking to repeal that law. Or it might be that you're interested in an arm's length way about how does such a law fit into the framework of the U.S. Code in general. Whatever your interest is, either one of those or several of those or something else, I am just going to give a 20,000-foot view of where we are. So as I said before, Aaron is a staff attorney at SLDN and will be much more specific than I am. But let me give you some overview here. Perhaps we should start with a little history. And I'm in the best position, I think, looking around the room of anyone to speak on topics of history. But the first thing I should say is that the broad context here is that we're talking about people who want to serve their country in the country's armed forces and are precluded from doing so. That's the broad context. So backing way up, you may know that it was not really that long ago that the U.S. military consisted only of white heterosexual males. It was not so long ago. At least officially, that was the case. It never actually was the case. Over time, various policy restrictions, of course, have come down. Blacks, Asians, even non-citizens, and more recently, women have been integrated into the military, although often in circumscribed roles. For example, there were periods, even when I was on active duty, when blacks and Asians were relegated to the role of stewards, which is to say servants of white officers. And women, up until very recently, have been relegated to clerical or office positions. Again, that has changed now. So that the only remaining official prohibition for physically and mentally capable people, those prohibitions are directed singularly at gay people. Again, I'll say gay people have always been in the military. I'm an example, for instance, but not openly. And that's what we're talking about now. So, the law. How did this law come about? Almost exactly 16 years ago, during another presidential campaign, there was a particularly heinous hate crime that occurred. A sailor was beaten to death brutally because he was or was thought to be gay. The publicity surrounding that crime caused candidate Bill Clinton to include repeal of the gay ban in his campaign promises. The ban against gays at the time was a military policy, not a law. So in March through July of 1993, after Mr. Clinton had become president, he endeavored to fulfill his campaign promise and ran into widespread, deep, and severe opposition in the United States Congress. So the House and Senate Armed Services Committee held hearings on changing these regulations. If one goes back, and certainly if you were there at the time, to review that testimony, the testimony was heavily weighted against gays serving in the military. During that period, the Rand Corporation issued an independent report finding no factual or statistical justification for continuing the ban against gay people serving openly in the military. That report got no play during the hearings and had no effect. Let's call it a compromise was reached so that gay people were allowed to serve in the military as long as they pretended to be not gay. And that's why the law is called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's a misnomer, by the way. They can ask, but you can't tell. And Aaron can go into a little bit more than that cute description on my part. Now let me shift focus just a second and talk briefly about this organization, Servicemembers Legal Defense Network. It's quite a mouthful, so we say SLDN. The reason it's called that is because our primary focus has been to provide legal aid services to people harmed by this law. Not all those people are gay, by the way, although presumably many of them are. The organization was started very shortly after the law was put into effect. There were a few people who said, this is not going to work. So we need to have some resources for people who are going to be harmed by this law to provide some protections for those people. So the legal aid services were created and offered, and over the years, the organization has provided these on a nonprofit, nonpartisan, free and confidential basis. We've answered 9,000 requests for assistance, and within those 9,000 requests, 2,100 of them have been actual cases. 5 years ago, SLDN felt that it was time to move to a new phase of the purpose of the organization. We wanted to continue providing these legal services, but we also wanted to embark upon efforts to overturn the law. Those efforts are well underway. There are 3 fronts. Judicial, there's a case in the court system now. Number 2, legislative, there's a bill in Congress with 144 co-sponsors in the House. And number 3, there's, of course, the court of public opinion. So SLDN creates press releases and has grassroots efforts and promotes volunteer speaking opportunities like this, and so forth and so on. So that's where we are. I'll stop there, and Aaron, please fill in all those blanks.
Okay. I guess the way to start thinking about this is that today and every single day, 2 people are still kicked out of the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which, as Tom said, is the only law that requires someone to be fired simply because they're gay. And to date, in the past 15 years, more than 12,500 people have been discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And you know, when you hear about numbers like that, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of meaning. So what I thought I would do is at least begin with one anecdote of someone who's discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, just to kind of flesh that out a little bit and just tell you one of those 12,500 stories. And the person I'm going to tell you about is named Monica Hill. She's actually one of the plaintiffs in our case that's currently in the First Circuit, so I can publicly say her name and not violate any confidentiality rules. And back in 1994, she had won a prestigious scholarship to attend medical school on the Air Force. The Air Force was going to pay her way, and then she'd have to serve following medical school. And we'll fast forward now to 2001, so it's about 9 years later, or I can't even do math, that's why I'm a lawyer. So about 7 years later or so, she is in Ohio, and she's now been with her partner, Terry, for about 14 years. And they're getting ready to move to Monica's first duty assignment in Andrews Air Force Base right outside of Washington, D.C. And during that summer, they find out that Terry has a horrible illness, and all the doctors can't figure it out, you know, exactly what it is. And Terry actually is a nurse in the same hospital where Monica's then doing her residency in this little town in Ohio. And eventually the doctors figure out that she has cancer, and it's brain cancer that's spread to her lungs. And she's given between 2 months and 2 years to live. And Monica and Terry decide this would not be an opportune time to move to Washington, D.C. They want to stay in the hospital where they both work, where they know the doctors, and spend the rest of their time there. So Monica tries to do everything in her power not to tell the military why she can't move at that point, because she realizes if she really had to tell them why she couldn't move, she'd be outing herself. and violating Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So she tries to do everything in her power not to tell the military why they can't move, but ultimately that's the only way she can explain why she can't move to Washington at that time. Luckily for them, the military grants some sort of deferment or a delay and says, okay, you don't have to move right at this time. A few months later, Terry dies from cancer. And then not long after that, Monica's, of course, discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell for having told. In addition, the military then recouped the entire cost of her medical school education, which is often what happens if you are discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The military can recoup against you. So that's just one of the 12,500 stories of people who have been kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell over the past 15 years. And like I said, 2 people every single day continue to be kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. What I'd like to do now is kind of flesh out a little bit about what Tom talked about and talk about a little bit more of what we do at SLDN, and then what does Don't Ask mean, what does Don't Tell mean, how does it all work, and what are some of the arguments that you hear in favor of it and against it. And of course, I'll focus more on the arguments against Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the ones in favor of it. So at Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Tom touched on the fact that we do lobbying now and litigation. And since we're at a law school, I'll fill you in a little bit on the litigation. We have a case that's currently in the First Circuit. It was dismissed at the district court level, and I'll throw in some civil procedure here, on a 12b6 motion to dismiss for failure to state a claim, basically relying on an interpretation of Lawrence and deference to Congress on military issues. And effectively, just to really kind of boil it down, the court said, we're going to look at this on a rational basis, under a rational basis form of review, and we're going to give a lot of deference to what the military decided in this kind of case. And therefore, it's really not just I can't even say it. We can't make a decision on this basis, and that's it. So we've been constantly appealing, and most recently we filed for a petition for rehearing en banc, and that was denied. So the only next step is the Supreme Court, and right now we're weighing our options about what to do next. In addition to that, there are 2 other cases sitting out there. The log cabins have a case out in the Ninth Circuit in California, and that's, I believe, at the district court level. It's kind of been stayed because there's another case also in the Ninth Circuit, the Witt case. It's Major Witt versus the United States Air Force, and that's in an interesting posture as well. That might be appealed to the Supreme Court, but on that side, it would be appealed to the Supreme Court by the government. In that case, the Ninth Circuit ruled that Don't Ask, Don't Tell could potentially violate the Constitution as applied to Major Witt, and ruled for intermediate scrutiny. So that might get kicked back down to the district court or might go up to the Supreme Court. So that's kind of out there right now. We all know what's going to happen. So that's just kind of a little bit of what's happening on the litigation front. And then Tom also touched on the Military Readiness Enhancement Act, which currently has even more now than 144 co-sponsors. It's up to like 147 or 149. And we're hoping for a Senate introduction later this year. And the purpose of that law is it would repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell and replace it with a policy of non-discrimination. So sexual orientation would effectively be treated like, anything under Title VII, like race, religion, national origin, so on and so forth. SLDN, I guess another thing to add is pro-military in the sense that we believe people should be able to serve regardless of sexual orientation. So we don't take a position, for example, on the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So what exactly is Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Well, it's a law, it's a statute, it's 10 U.S.C. 654. As Tom said, it was passed by Congress back in 1993. And at the time, like Tom said, it replaced what was originally a policy, a DoD policy. And that DoD policy was actually written down starting in approximately 1981 under the Reagan administration. But in reality, there's actually been a ban on gay people serving in the military ever since World War II. But in 1981, that became an actual regulation. And in that regulation, it said that the military banned homosexuality. So when this great compromise was reached in 1993, they said, we're going to move this away from status, and we're going to base it on conduct. So basically, if you look at this prior regulation, anytime where it talked about homosexuality, they replaced it with the phrase homosexual conduct. And it began this kind of charade of saying, this is just about conduct. You can be gay, but don't do gay. and you'll be okay. But in reality, if you look at how they define homosexual conduct, it's being gay, because homosexual conduct in the wacky world of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is defined at all these things which aren't really conduct. It includes statements. A statement to anyone, anywhere, anytime, ever, that you're gay. So if you came out nursery school, for sake of example, and you told your nursery school teacher that you're gay, that could get you kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It includes ever, to anyone. And I'll give you more examples of that a little bit later. It includes homosexual acts. Acts are any touching for sexual gratification. It includes hand-holding, close dancing, or use your imagination with anyone of the same sex. And then lastly, it includes marriage or attempted marriage to someone of the same sex, which of course has all new meaning now given California and Massachusetts. So those are the three things that will get you kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell: statements, acts, or marriage. And that's kind of the general background there. The standard of proof you would need to be kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell officially is credible information from a reliable source. But as we've seen in our line of work, that can be an anonymous email. I spoke to someone yesterday who has been outed by an anonymous email. So we'll see what happens with that. But that, in the past, has been deemed credible and reliable for whatever reason. So what is Don't Ask? The first part of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. As Tom said, there's nothing in the law itself about not asking. And in fact, people are asked pretty much every day of the week. And if you think about it this way, it's not necessarily malicious, but it's questions like, what did you do this weekend? Or what are you going to be doing Saturday night? Or what are you doing for Thanksgiving or Christmas or any sort of holiday you celebrate? And if you maybe are going to your boyfriend or girlfriend's house, like how would you talk about that? And how would that all play out? From the moment people join the military, they have to decide, are they going to lie about their private life? Are they going to try to evade and not really talk about it? Or how are they going to approach the issue? And that's something we tell our clients, especially those who call us before they join. We tell them, this is something you're going to have to think about before you join the military. And one example I'll give about this is one of the very first people I spoke to in my job, which was a surgeon in the Army. He was located in a very small town in Texas. And he worked with the same surgical team every single day. He got to know these people really well. And just like you could imagine, you're getting to know your classmates really well. And they would ask him, like, you're a really nice guy. Do you want to be set up with, this female friend I have? Or my sister's looking for someone. You want to meet her? Stuff like that. Just natural questions that people ask every day. And he really couldn't take it anymore, the idea of having to lie to these people that he worked with on a daily basis. In addition to that, he actually already lived with his partner in this town. And he was paranoid about going out on the weekends with him in case someone might see them at the movies together or eating dinner together. When he'd leave their house in the morning, he wouldn't put on his military uniform because he's afraid someone would see him coming out of another man's house and what the repercussions for that would be. And, like a decent number of people we speak to, he couldn't take it anymore, this having to lie every single day, day in and day out, and ultimately decided to come out for integrity reasons. That's just one example of how someone in their line of work was asked, and that happens all the time. So what is... Oh, actually, one more little point on Don't Ask. Like I said, there's nothing in the law about not asking. The only place it really comes up nowadays is in the implementing regulations. And what they say is you're not allowed to be asked anymore when you join the military during what's called a session. So if you go to a military recruiting station, unlike the good old days, they can't really ask you this anymore. And if they do, that would be a violation of the implementing regulations. So that's the only time Don't Ask comes up at all. But in the actual law, there's nothing at all about not asking. So then we turn to Don't Tell, which is actually the most unforgiving part of the law. And like I said, it means don't tell anyone, anywhere, anytime, ever. And I think the best way to explain this is just to give you some examples of cases that we've had over the years and some kind of general areas of people that you shouldn't tell, like your family, because they can out you. And we've had cases where parents out their children. The person you're dating. We've had many, many cases of people who say, you break up with me, I'm going to out you to your commander, for example. Happens all the time. Friends, you upset a friend, they out you. You can't be out to a military psychologist because there's no duty of confidentiality there with respect to sexual orientation. Can't be out to a military chaplain because there's no confidentiality there necessarily. Can't be out to a military doctor because there's no confidentiality there. So people are, in fact, even if they are not outed all the time, they risk being outed by anyone they're ever out to in their life. We've had a number of MySpace page cases. I had a guy at the very end of last December, who was about a month away from finishing his commitment in the military. And some civilian he worked with was pissed off at him, Googled him, found a MySpace page, printed it out, and turned it into his commander. And they initiated discharge proceedings because he had made a statement. He said he was gay on his MySpace page. So that's just one example. A sadder example, perhaps, is we had a client who was stationed over in Iraq, and his partner of approximately 9 years was actually hit by a cab and killed. And in a normal circumstance, if you were married to someone or had a close relationship with them, the military would let you go back home, if you could otherwise get out of Iraq, and go to the funeral. And he had to decide at that point, did he want to end his military career and come out and explain the nature of his relationship to this person he was with for 9 years? Or did he have to keep quiet about it? And ultimately, he decided he wanted to keep his job. So they gave him a day off to mourn the loss of a friend in his tent, and that's all he got. I just spoke to someone on the phone, actually, just yesterday, who is currently on a suicide watch because he's struggling. He has, I'm sure, many issues, but one of the things he's struggling with is his sexual orientation. And I found it so bizarre that here I was talking to this guy, and I kept on repeating that, the most important thing to think about right now is your health and your mental health and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I was warning him repeatedly, well, you have to be very careful when you talk to the military psychologist because he's at a military hospital. Because if you come out to them, then you might lose your job because of this. But the problem there is that his depression is part and parcel connected to his sexual orientation and the issues he's going through there. So it's this real balancing act for people who are in that situation. And it puts a real burden on these people who are already sacrificing so much to have to then deal with this other element out there and not to be able to get, for example, in this person's case, the treatment that he needs. We have domestic violence cases. So imagine this scenario. You're a victim of domestic violence, for example, and say you get beaten up by your partner, same-sex partner. And you'd want to go to the hospital about this because you have to get treated. There's a duty to report any sort of medical treatment to the military. On top of that, most police forces, just as a matter of course, report any sort of police report back to the military police. So say you're getting beat up by your partner, you report that to the police and you go to the hospital. All that information can then get turned over to the military, and then you would lose your job for saying this is a domestic violence dispute. And there's always the risk of that happening. Luckily in Washington, D.C., where SLDN is based, there's a lesbian gay liaison unit, and they know how to take all that information down confidentially and basically get people the treatment they need without necessarily reporting all the details back to the military. And that's lucky for people who are in the Washington, D.C. area. But if you're at some random base around the country, that might not work so well. So that's an example of issues that come up. We deal with divorce and child custody issues. You'll have people who maybe figure out their sexual orientation down the road and are getting a divorce or whatever the case is. And this information could come up in the court hearing, and that ends up being a public statement of their sexual orientation, and that can be used against the service member or something to hold against the service member in trying to get a better deal out of the divorce. We had a client who was basically forced into a relationship with a civilian doctor who basically said, if you don't sleep with me, I'll out you to your command. And at that point, there's nothing illegal about outing him, because that's not illegal to tell someone, or tell someone that someone else is gay. But there he had to choose, like, what do we do? Does he have this relationship with his doctor, or does he want his job? So that's an example of how someone could be outed under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We speak to people all the time who are going through security clearance interview processes. And there, people understand they're supposed to be honest, but then at the same time, they realize, well, if I'm honest, what about Don't Ask, Don't Tell? It's not going to come up. There's actually a loophole, and we can get into the nitty-gritty of that, but there's basically a loophole that says you should still be honest in the security clearance interview process, and that won't be used against you under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So we advise people about that sort of issue all the time. And another, I guess, last issue I'll talk about is harassment. And we have people who are, there's plenty of people who have successful experiences in the military and who are not harassed, and people are very accepting. But there are those occasions where people are harassed. And the tough thing we have to advise our clients about is how to report that harassment in a safe way that doesn't cause them to lose their job. So, for example, we had a client and someone wrote faggot on his bunk bed. If he went to the military police at that point and said, well, someone wrote this on my bunk bed because I'm gay, he has then outed himself and made a statement in violation of the homosexual conduct policy and could lose his job. So we have to warn these people how to safely report harassment by either just saying, kind of like a Columbo sort of moment, just stick to the facts, just the facts, and say someone wrote this on my bed and that's it. Or maybe, although this gets kind of difficult with some of these folks, is to explain, well, I think they wrote this because they perceive that I'm gay. And then you won't be making a statement about your sexual orientation. But it could raise some inferences and people could maybe pay closer attention to you because of that. So those are some examples of ways people tell and get in trouble for all the time. And it's, I think, not what a lot of people think of. You can imagine talking to the average Joe out there, and he or she would say, well, people shouldn't just come to work and tell them your private business and about, your sexual life and that you're gay. But as you see, based on, the clients that we talk to, that's not what it's about. It's just about living your life and how don't ask, don't tell gets caught up in absolutely everything you could possibly do. The other category I had mentioned that gets you kicked out under don't ask, don't tell is acts. Homosexual acts, as they're called. And just to think of a very simple example, if you think about pictures on TV when a ship comes in, when it comes back to port, and you have like the men or women on the ship run down the gangplank and go and hug and kiss their partners and hug their kids and pick them up and throw them around and all that stuff. If you do that and you're gay, you lose your job. And actually you risk getting an other than honorable discharge characterization because you've then engaged in a public homosexual act with someone of the same sex. So, we were speaking to some clients of ours out in California, and they said, well, they'd have to go off the ship and then go several blocks away from the ship and then maybe hug each other in the car, kind of away from everyone else. But, simply that act of hugging your boyfriend or girlfriend when you get off the ship can very well get you discharged. So that's just one example. We've had hugs cases, people hugging someone else. We've had hand-holding cases. We've had hand on the shoulder of someone else in a photo case where someone had a picture in his locker with his arm on his cousin's shoulder. That was enough to begin an investigation against him under the homosexual conduct policy. So all sorts of crazy cases under the acts prong of don't ask, don't tell. So in addition to explaining what don't ask means and what don't tell means, what is the actual impact of this? Well, as I said, more than 12,500 people have been discharged under don't ask, don't tell in the last 15 years. It actually has a disproportionate effect on young people. About 80% of the discharges under don't ask, don't tell are of those people between the ages of 18 and 25. And this is really important because the military is one of the largest funders of higher education. And it's also one of the largest employers in the country of people in that age group. And some of the saddest cases I have, and you can have these cases with these horrible, horrible fact patterns, but that actually sounded very legal, didn't it? But you have these cases with these horrible facts, and some of the saddest cases are people who are just 19 years old, and they're out to some people in their unit, and someone finally outs them for whatever reason, and they get kicked out of the military. Now they've lost their job, they've lost all of their friends, they lost the roof over their head, and maybe they have to go back to their parents. And I'm thinking of one guy in particular who had to go back and live with his mom in Ohio, and she doesn't really like gay people very much. So this is the first time he had to come out to her too, because he had explained why he lost his job. So you have just the run-of-the-mill case like that can, even cases like that can be very sad. And that's just an example of the typical person who falls into that age group. In terms of the actual consequences when you are discharged, you get a lifetime ban on ever serving in the military again. It's called an RE4 code, a negative reenlistment code. So if you're kicked out of the Air Force, you can never serve in the Army, the Air Force, any of the services again, the Guard, Reserve, anything, for life. In addition to that, your DD-214, which is your discharge paperwork, actually says on it homosexual conduct or words to that effect. So as we half-jokingly say, it's the only place in the country where you can be federally certified as gay, because it doesn't say that on your paperwork. And that has real repercussions for people. If you're in a big city like New York, it might not be a big deal, but when you apply for jobs, a lot of employers will ask for that information to make sure you have a good service record. And on it, they'll see that you're gay. And you think about all these states out there where people don't have protections against employment discrimination, that can have a real impact. there's an estimated 65,000 people in the military who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual currently serving. And they go through all of the stuff every single day. So what are some of the arguments for and against Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Well, the arguments that are basically put out there, at least nowadays, in favor of keeping Don't Ask, Don't Tell is it's necessary for unit cohesion, morale, good order, and discipline. And yes, those are very vague terms, and it's hard to define exactly what that means. So what are some of the arguments against those arguments? Well, there's the obvious argument that this is an unfair, unjust law, that discriminates people who are patriotic and who simply just want to serve their country. But on top of that, the enforcement of the law shows the military itself doesn't even believe those rationales. And if you look at the statistics, ever since World War II, in every single conflict since World War II, discharges have dropped in a time of conflict. And even now, since 9/11, discharges have gone down by about a half. And you'd think this would be the time when we're struggling to fight two wars, when unit cohesion, morale, good order, and discipline would be most important. But this is a time when discharges of gay people drop. So, it shows that the military itself doesn't even believe in that. And even anecdotally, aside from the statistics, we have plenty of cases where people come out to their commands and they say, yeah, we don't care. Or they're like, okay, well, we'll think about that. They deploy them to Iraq and they come back and then they get discharged. And you think if there was some rationale behind the policy, they wouldn't be doing that. One case in point, one of our more public cases, is that of Darren Manzella, who came out after being threatened with being outed and just wanted to come out on his own terms, effectively. And this was over a year ago now. After that, they basically, against our advice, he provided pictures to his command of him kissing his boyfriend in his car and, photos, all that sort of stuff. And it was pretty obvious he was gay. Nonetheless, he said, we don't believe you. There's no proof that you're gay. We're going to deploy you. So off he went to the Middle East. And he was there for about 6 months when we were looking for someone to do a story in The Advocate. And they wanted to have someone who's currently serving, who was okay with being public about it. So we got in touch with Darren. He's willing to do it. So they put a full-page picture of him in The Advocate saying he was gay, and he had the whole interview and all that. They didn't do anything. There's another 6 months went by, and then we were talking with 60 Minutes, and they wanted to do a story on someone who was openly serving. So we called back Darren again. And at that point, he had been out to, as he says, at least 100 people in his unit, including the person who did the briefings at the beginning of the Gulf War, like this high-up general. And so we talked to Darren again, and then Leslie Stahl snuck into Kuwait and interviewed him. And finally, that really did it. When he was in front of a very large, several million people audience on 60 Minutes, they finally ended up kicking him out. But it just shows you, he was out to all these people, and as he says, no one had a problem with it. It really wasn't an issue. And that's a common thing we're hearing more and more from the people we represent. The people, they might be outed by vindictive, nasty people here and there, and that's because it's used as a tool for vengeance. But most of the people they serve with really don't care. They just care that they're serving well, and they back them up and do what they need to do and do their jobs. So most people don't really care that these people are gay. It's not an issue at all. In addition to that, right now, we're serving with many foreign militaries overseas. And the foreign military point has kind of two sub-points to it. First of all, many of these militaries had former bans like we currently have. So they prohibited gay people back in the day, like the United Kingdom, Israel, France, Australia, so on and so forth. All of them have gotten rid of those bans. And there's some countries out there, like Turkey, for example, that still have bans. But most of our allies in NATO, for example, don't have these bans anymore. And we currently serve with them overseas. So you would think if it's so detrimental to unit cohesion, morale, good order, and discipline, why would we ever serve with all these foreign militaries where there's openly gay people? We couldn't use their services, but we do. And we're serving right alongside them under the same commands over in Iraq and Afghanistan as we speak. So their experiences show that not only was lifting their bans not a problem, but we're agreeing to serve with them. So there's kind of 2 points to be made there. In addition to that, many of our people in the military are currently serving with people who are civilians in the CIA, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the National Security Agency, who are all over there too. And you can imagine someone in the military sitting next to someone in a cubicle who works for the CIA. And the person in the CIA is protected under an executive order, so they can be out. but the person in the military cannot. And again, if it were so detrimental to unit cohesion, so on and so forth, the military would never want to work with anyone from the CIA because there might be a gay person, openly gay person there, and it would destroy everything. So we still work with them, and it's fine. We also have people who get kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and basically become contractors and do the very same job they were doing, and get paid a hell of a lot more. I had a client who was an air traffic controller, got kicked out, and he's over in Afghanistan now. He was an air traffic controller for like KBR or Halliburton or something, and making a lot of money, and doing the very same thing he did before. That's another example. And the last point we like to make here is that forcing people to lie and not be truthful about who they are actually hurts unit cohesion, morale, good order, and discipline. And if you could imagine, and this is from speaking to people in the military, that you're working with people day in and day out, and you can never really get to know them because there's this huge wall between you and them. And I was speaking to someone who, and I forget what her exact title was, but it was kind of like the head enlisted person on a ship with 300 sailors beneath her. And people would come to her with problems and all that sort of stuff. And you can imagine someone comes to talk to you about maybe a relationship problem, because everyone has that sort of stuff. And it can never be a two-way street with her. She can't say, oh, I can relate, I had that problem. Or, I've been there too. She can't say that. And you can never establish those bonds of trust or getting to know people if you can't be open about who you are. And what we found is that when people can be honest about who they are, that actually builds unit cohesion, morale, good order, and discipline, and all that stuff. And it's requiring people to be in the closet and to lie about the very core of who they are that actually harms all of those things. So I think that's all that I had to say. But we can certainly open the floor to questions, and you can ask anything you want, really.
Anything else?
No, I think we'd be delighted to see what's on people's minds, questions or comments.
Absolutely. Also, as we do that, I'm going to have, if you don't mind, passing around. If you wish to, it's a petition to Congress on SLD and I guess stationary, as it were. You can read it if you feel so inclined. Please add your name. So I would like to open it up to questions. I saw some hands we had. Okay. In the green.
I wonder if you could just muse on the possible implications of this law if the draft were ever reinstated.
That's a good point, and we get those questions once in a while. And I think it would work much the same as it works now. I mean, they couldn't ask you, but if you came out, then technically they shouldn't be taking you, you could say. But as we see now, that people do come out and they take you anyway. And, we've...
Do you think that could be a way to challenge the law if that ever came up?
I don't know. I guess we'd have to look into it more. I don't know what the grounds would be, but it'd be kind of interesting.
I'm not sure I can articulate the grounds, but it seems to me logical and rational that it would be grounds. If you're forcing one, i.e. a draft, into the military, wouldn't that give you some sort of grounds? I mean, I suppose they could carve out an excluded class, as has been done in the past, but if they didn't, I mean, it would certainly stimulate discussion, absolutely.
What happened during the last time we had a draft? The military apparently had a policy against gay people serving them. How did that work with the draft?
Well, Tom was there.
I can speak. I wasn't drafted, but it was during the Vietnam War when almost everyone was drafted if you were physically and mentally otherwise capable of serving. So when I was, going to graduate from Trinity College here at Duke, I would have certainly been draft material. So instead of that, I joined the Navy ROTC unit here at Duke. I wasn't so much focused on that at the time, but my recollection is, there were forms to fill out. And one of the questions was to the effect of, have you ever had or been interested in, homosexual acts? Well, in those days, you wouldn't answer that yes, although I think a number of people did answer it yes, who were not gay, because they didn't want to, they'd rather do that than go to Canada, But that's how that was handled as far as I know.
Well, there are certainly witch hunts and people got kicked out back in the day, and we hear from
yeah.
people who come out of the woodwork all the time. I mean, we spoke to someone recently who was discharged as a class 2 homosexual, and I don't know why he wasn't like class 1, but he's only class 2, and I don't even know what it means, but that's how he was kicked out, and I think that was during the Korean War. And we hear from people like that all the time who want to get upgraded and get honorable discharges. So people were kicked out, and often you'd hear they were thrown in prison and all these horror stories. So I think they were treated much differently than you'd be treated today.
I think that's a point worth emphasizing. This law is new as a law, but the policy has existed for quite some time. And anti-gay fervor was even more intense, I think, a few years ago than it is now. I mean, I think there's a certain balance among most people in this country, certainly across Europe. But, I mean, it was, what's the phrase? The sin that dares not speak its name. I mean, it was something that was simply not discussed. I can tell you here on this campus, it didn't exist. It just did not exist. So that was the sort of attitude in those days, was that that's just not something anybody talks about because we don't know anybody, Anyway.
Just on the point of the Vietnam War era in the draft, a few of my friends who were drafted, there was the notion of, did you check the box? I mean, that was sort of how it was spoken of. And at least one person that I know checked the box, and they wanted him to, wanted more proof. Like, tell me more, almost, whether they had prurient interest at that point in knowing all the details, I don't know, but they would investigate a little bit so that folks who were trying to check the box just to get out and lie about being gay, they weren't just accepting that, but people did check the box and get out.
I think that is true. I think, again, we probably need to transport ourselves back to that time. There were people who did a lot of things not to get drafted into the Vietnam War era because of the statistical probability that they would be killed. I mean, we don't get too much more basic than that. But if you didn't think you were going to get killed, checking the box was not a thing to take lightly. That could go on with you, throughout your life. And in society in those days, that would have absolutely precluded you from getting jobs and that kind of thing. It was a huge scandal and monkey on your back.
Chris? In terms of your litigation, have you tried using the example you gave of the soldier who sort of outed himself and essentially served for 6 months with everybody knowing, to sort of prove, try and show that the interests that the government has given aren't actually their interests, and it's basically just a pure hatred of gays that illustrates their policy rather than any sort of positive? Is that something that you guys have used in your litigation versus?
Yep. We actually had 12 plaintiffs when we initially filed. One of them split off, and he's representing himself pro se right now. But one of our plaintiffs, Jenny Kopstein, came out to her command, was tired of lying about who she was, so on and so forth, and then ended up serving for 2 more years, was promoted, was given the right to basically captain the ship at certain points, and ultimately was then kicked out 2 years later. Both of her commanding officers during that time testified at her board that she was an asset to the Navy, and they didn't want to discharge her, but they felt, for whatever reason, they felt the pressure to do it at that point. So that certainly is one of the examples we give in our litigation, that people openly serve and it's not a problem anymore, and that military keeps known gay people, in the military, and it's just fine. I'm thinking back to some of the other plaintiffs that we have. We have one person, Tommy Cook, the named plaintiff. If I'm not confusing his story with someone else's, he was with a small group of folks, and someone who'd be commanding him walked by and said, if I ever knew someone in my unit was gay, I would kill him. And they were just getting ready to deploy overseas, and that freaked out Tommy just a little bit. So he decided to report that up his chain of command and said he was kind of freaked out because he's gay, and here this guy is saying he's going to kill gay people in his unit. So they discharged him under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So there's all sorts of interesting examples, and all of their stories are actually available on our website at sldn.org. If you look under our litigation section.
Cassius. So I haven't taken evidence, so these might be easy questions that I just don't know. The two things are first, has your organization had any issues or anyone being subpoenaed in order when they're trying to produce evidence of being gay? Have your organization been subpoenaed to produce that evidence for the government? And secondly, what sort of, if you have somebody who is accused as gay and is straight, not homosexual, what sort of abilities can you produce to prove that accusation in court, for example?
A great question, or two questions. We've never been subpoenaed, and we have had clients who've been asked to prove that they're gay, and they'll say, "Show me photos of you having sex in the barracks," or bad things like that. And we tell people they really shouldn't turn that over because then they could be criminally prosecuted and given other than honorable discharge characterization. So we don't recommend that. And I can get more into the criminal prosecutions because people are still, in fact, prosecuted for consensual sodomy in certain circumstances in the military, and that's another thing we work on at the organization. And then your second question, this is bad, I'm going to forget it already.
It's how you refute the
Oh, right, okay. In a statements case, it can be very difficult because either you kind of made the statement or you didn't. And there's not much, under the law, there's not much room for argument there. You could argue that it wasn't credible information from a reliable source, but that doesn't always help. You might argue, well, you can't prove it's their MySpace page, for example, or it often comes down to like he said, she said. Someone's claiming that you came out to them and you claim that you didn't. And it can come down to credibility. There's no federal rules of evidence in an administrative separation process. So it all comes down to the standard of relevance. That's it. So there's no exclusionary act for something, for example, nothing like that. No way to keep out the evidence. In an acts case, any sort of the touching for sexual gratification, in the law, there's approximately 5 to 7 or so things you can argue to say that you really are not gay. So even though they pretend this law is not about being gay, you can argue these things to basically argue that you're straight. So, for example, you can argue that it was a one-time event, not likely to recur, kind of out of your character. I was really drunk at this bar and I kissed the other guy because I was just wasted. And if you could really make that argument and make it well, then they can retain you. We had a case, which was kind of an interesting case, of someone who wanted to get together with this woman that he liked at a party. And she basically said something like, you have to sleep with me and my male friend, and if you do that, then I'll hang out with you, so to speak. And he went for it. And they initiated discharge proceedings under the homosexual conduct policy, as it's referred to in the military. And that was his defense at the board, that I did it just to get with the woman. And it worked. He was retained. So if you can basically prove you're not really gay in these acts cases, then you might be able to be retained. And it really is fact-specific and circumstance-specific, and depending on what the allegations are.
As usual, I'll make a much less specific comment, but it might be interesting to also note in this general area that women are disproportionately more harmed than men in the military, and the statistics are double or something like that. And one common scenario is, of course, some guy hitting on some gal, and she's just not interested, and so he starts the rumor that she's gay. And then the rumor mill goes and goes and goes, and all of a sudden an investigation ensues, and she's, caught up in that maelstrom, whether she is or isn't. Often isn't. Again, I can't tell you how that plays out, but we hear that a lot.
Yep.
And again, if you look at the statistics,
well, women comprise approximately 15% of the armed services, and in the past they were about 30% of the discharges, so twice the rate. But in fact, in this past year, and I don't remember the specific service by service, but in some services they were 50% of the discharges under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So they are much more disproportionately affected than men.
All right, I'd like to just let you know that Aaron is available if you want to speak to him about his career, his path, and feel free to come up and say hello if you like. But please join me in thanking our speakers today.